What if the single worst financial decision of your life turned out to be the moment everything changed? A widow stood in a dusty livestock pen, her hands shaking as she signed away her last hope. The cow beside her was all she had left, one animal between her and absolute poverty. Then she saw the foal, skinny, broken, limping on 3 legs while the fourth hung at a twisted angle that made grown men look away. Nobody wanted him. The auctioneer's voice had gone flat with disgust. The slaughter buyer was already writing his offer. And this woman, this foolish, desperate widow, did something everyone would call insane. She traded her cow, her last asset, her final safety net, for a crippled horse that couldn't even walk. What she couldn't have known, what nobody in that crowded auction yard could have imagined, was that this dying foal carried a secret written in his very bones, a truth that would transform her poverty into abundance and prove that sometimes the heart sees value the eyes cannot. This is a story about the courage to choose compassion when logic screams otherwise, about hidden worth waiting to be discovered, and about how the things we save often end up saving us. If you believe that kindness is never wasted and that miracles hide in broken places, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support helps us share more stories of hope, transformation, and the extraordinary power of refusing to turn away. The flatlands of Lancaster County, Nebraska, stretch out in endless waves of brown and gold, a sea of prairie grass and cropland broken only by the occasional windbreak of cottonwood trees and the scattered white farmhouses that dot the landscape like ships frozen in an ocean of earth. It is a place of enormous sky and brutal weather, where summer heat can crack the ground open and winter cold can kill livestock in a single night. The people who live here are shaped by the land, made hard and practical by necessity, because sentiment is a luxury you cannot afford when your survival depends on making the right choice every single time. In the town of Crossroads, population 800 and declining, failure carried a particular kind of shame. It was a judgment rendered not in words but in silence, in the way neighbors stopped waving when you drove past, in the way the bank manager's face went carefully blank when you walked through the door. Foreclosure notices were posted at the courthouse every month, a public record of dreams that had died, and people read them the way they might read obituaries, with a mixture of sympathy and relief that this time, at least, it wasn't them. Margaret Foster was 48 years old and looked 60, her face carved into deep lines by 5 years of grief and struggle. Her husband, David, had died of a heart attack while fixing fence wire, dropped dead in the south pasture on a blazing July afternoon, and she'd found him hours later when he didn't come in for dinner. They'd been married 26 years. They'd built their small dairy operation together from nothing, 30 acres and a dozen Jersey cows, working dawn to dusk every day, their hands permanently rough, their backs permanently aching, but they'd been happy, or happy enough. The dairy had been their child, the child they'd never been able to have, and David had loved those cows with a tenderness he'd rarely shown other humans. When he died, Margaret tried to keep it going. She hired help she couldn't afford, worked herself into exhaustion, borrowed money from the bank against equipment that was already mortgaged, and watched helplessly as the operation slowly collapsed. Milk prices fell. Feed costs rose. A wet spring brought pneumonia that killed 4 calves. The bank called in her loans. One by one, she sold the cows, each sale a small death, until only Rosie remained. Rosie, the oldest cow, the one David had bought at their first auction 20 years ago. The gentle brown Jersey with patient eyes who still came when called and stood quietly for milking. Margaret had received the final foreclosure notice 3 weeks ago. 30 days to pay $12,000 or lose the farm. She had $160 in her checking account and a cow worth maybe $900. The mathematics were clear and cruel. The livestock auction in Crossroads happened every second Saturday. A sprawling complex of metal buildings and wooden pens where farmers came to buy and sell cattle, pigs, chickens, and horses. The air smelled of manure and diesel fuel, of sweat and desperation, and the concrete floors were stained dark from decades of animals passing through. Margaret arrived early, leading Rosie on a worn rope halter, the cow's hooves clicking on the pavement, her brown eyes calm and trusting. Margaret's throat was so tight she could barely breathe. She registered with the clerk, an older man who looked at her over his reading glasses with something that might have been pity. And then she stood by the rail, watching other people's animals sell. Her hands clenched so hard her fingernails left marks in her palms. A good breeding heifer brought $1,800. A pair of steers brought $2,200. Margaret watched the money change hands and felt sick with envy and shame. Why couldn't she have good luck? Why couldn't something just once go right? Lot 47, Jersey cow, 10 years old, good production, gentle. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the speakers, his rapid chant filling the building, and Margaret watched Rosie walk into the ring. The cow looked around, confused, searching for Margaret, and when she didn't see her, she lowed, a sound of distress that cut through all the other noise. The bidding started at $300. It climbed slowly, $400, $500, $600. Margaret counted every increment like she was counting her own heartbeats. $700, $800, $850. Then silence. The auctioneer pushed, his voice going higher, more urgent, but nobody raised their card. Going once, twice, sold for $850. Margaret collected her check from the cashier's window, her hands trembling so badly she could barely sign her name. $850. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She'd sold her last friend, betrayed the one creature who'd stood by her through everything, and it still wouldn't save her. She folded the check and put it in her pocket, and she turned to leave, to walk out of this place and never come back, when she heard the commotion at the far end of the barn. A crowd had gathered near the horse pens, and there was shouting, the kind of angry, frustrated shouting that meant something had gone wrong. Margaret walked toward it without knowing why, drawn by some instinct she couldn't name. Through the crowd, she saw a horse. No, not a horse. A foal. Maybe a year old, maybe less, so thin his ribs showed through his dull coat like the bars of a cage. But it was his leg that made people stare. His right front leg was bent at an impossible angle below the knee. The bone clearly broken and healed wrong, leaving the hoof dangling uselessly. He was holding it up, balanced on 3 legs, his body shaken with the effort. 2 men were trying to force him toward a trailer marked with the logo of a rendering plant, the slaughter truck. The foal was fighting. Despite his injury, despite his obvious weakness, he was pulling back, his eyes rolling white with terror, his small hooves skittering on the concrete as he tried desperately to escape. One of the men, a heavy-set guy in a stained shirt, hit the foal across the neck with a lead rope. "Stop it," Margaret heard herself say. The words came out before she could think, before she could stop them. The man turned, his face red and angry. "Lady, this ain't your concern." "That's cruel," Margaret said. Her voice was shaking but firm. "He's terrified." The man spat on the ground. "He's meat. That's all he's good for. Can't walk, can't work, can't do nothing but eat. You want him? Otherwise, get out of the way." Margaret looked at the foal. He had stopped struggling and was staring at her, his sides heaving, his nostrils flared. His coat was a dirty gray-brown, matted and dull, but his eyes were large and dark and held an intelligence that seemed almost human. He was looking at her like an animal looks at a person, but like a drowning man looks at a lifeboat. "Please." The word wasn't spoken, but she heard it anyway. "How much?" Margaret asked. The man laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "For this piece of junk? $300. That's what the meat buyer's paying per head. You want to save him, that's the price." Margaret's hand went to her pocket, to the check that was supposed to be her last hope. $850. If she gave this man $300, she'd have $550 left. Still not enough to save the farm. Still not enough for anything that mattered. But if she didn't, if she walked away, this foal would be loaded onto that truck and driven to his death in fear and pain. "I'll give you $850, Margaret heard herself say, "for him, and for you to never touch another animal that way again." The man's eyes widened. "Lady, you're crazy. He's worthless." "Maybe," Margaret said, "but he's not going to die afraid." The man stared at her for a long moment. Then he shrugged, snatched the check from her hand, and scrawled a bill of sale on a scrap of paper. He tossed the lead rope at her feet and walked away, already laughing and telling his buddy about the stupid woman who just paid good money for a crippled horse. Margaret picked up the rope. Her hands were steady now, her mind oddly calm. She had just done something monumentally foolish. She had traded her last money, her final hope of saving the farm, for a horse that would probably die within the week. But when she approached the foal and he didn't pull away, when he lowered his head and pressed his muzzle gently against her chest, she felt something she hadn't felt in 5 years. She felt needed. She felt like she'd made a choice that mattered. The walk back to the farm took 2 hours. The foal couldn't move faster than a slow, painful hobble, and Margaret had to stop every few hundred feet to let him rest. Cars passed them on the county road, slowing down to stare at the strange sight of a woman leading a crippled horse along the shoulder. Some people honked. One truck pulled over and the driver, an older rancher Margaret recognized from church, leaned out his window. "Margaret, what in God's name are you doing?" "Trying to get home," Margaret said simply. "That horse is lame. I can see that. You need help?" She looked at the foal, at his trembling legs, his exhausted eyes, and she shook her head. "No, thank you. We'll make it." The rancher looked at her like she'd lost her mind, and maybe she had, but he drove away without another word. By the time they reached the farm, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and Margaret's feet were blistered and aching. She led the foal into the small barn, into the single stall that still had clean bedding, and she filled a bucket with water from the pump. He drank desperately, his muzzle submerged, water splashing everywhere, and when he finished he stood with his head hanging low, utterly spent. Margaret sank onto a hay bale and looked at what she'd done. The foal was in worse shape than she'd realized. Besides the broken leg, he had cuts and scrapes all over his body. His hooves were cracked and overgrown, and when she ran her hand along his side, she could count every rib. He'd been starved. He'd been neglected. And now he was hers. She had no money to feed him, no money for a vet, no money for anything. In 3 weeks the bank would take her farm, and she'd be homeless with a crippled horse she couldn't afford to keep. It was the stupidest thing she'd ever done. She started to cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears running down her face, her shoulders shaking. She cried for David, for Rosie, for the farm she was going to lose, for this broken horse, for all of it. The foal shifted, and she felt his breath on her hair. He'd moved closer, was standing right beside her, and he lowered his head until his muzzle rested on her shoulder. It was a gesture of such gentle deliberateness, such clear intent to comfort, that Margaret's breath caught. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the soft velvet of his nose, the warmth of him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know what I was thinking. I can't save you. I can't even save myself." The foal didn't move. He just stood there, this broken creature offering what comfort he could. And Margaret realized something. She'd been wrong. She hadn't saved him. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, they could save each other. She stood up, wiped her eyes, and got to work. She had 3 weeks before everything fell apart. 3 weeks to try. She cleaned the foal, working carefully around his injured leg, using warm water and a soft cloth to wash away weeks of accumulated filth. Beneath the dirt, his coat was actually a pale silver gray, almost luminous in the dim light of the barn. His mane, once she worked out the tangles, was long and surprisingly fine, the color of moonlight. He stood quietly for the grooming, his eyes half closed, and Margaret realized he wasn't just tolerating her touch, he was starved for it. Nobody had been kind to this horse, maybe ever. She examined the leg as carefully as she could. The break was old, maybe 6 months, and it had healed completely wrong. The bones had fused at an angle that made normal walking impossible. A veterinarian might have been able to set it properly when it first happened, but now it was too late. The damage was permanent. The next morning, Margaret woke to find the foal watching her from his stall, his head over the gate, his ears pricked forward with interest. She'd slept in the barn, unable to bear the thought of leaving him alone in a strange place, and her back was screaming from a night on a hay bale. But when she saw him alert and calm, when she saw that he'd eaten the handful of grain she'd left him, she felt something close to hope. She spent the day doing what she could with what she had. She trimmed his hooves using David's old tools, working carefully, talking to him constantly. She mixed up a mash using the last of her chicken feed and some molasses she found in the back of the cupboard, trying to get calories into him. She fashioned a makeshift sling using old canvas and rope, rigging it from the barn beam so he could rest his weight without putting pressure on the bad leg. It took hours of trial and error, but when she finally got it adjusted right, when the foal's hooves were barely touching the ground and his whole body relaxed with relief, she knew she'd done something right. That afternoon, she walked to the library in town, to the computer terminal that offered free internet access, because she no longer had a phone or a computer at home. She searched for information on horses with broken legs, on healing, on rehabilitation. Most of what she found was discouraging. Horses with severe leg injuries were usually euthanized. The few success stories involved massive veterinary intervention and months of intensive care. Things she couldn't afford. But she kept reading, taking notes on a scrap of paper, learning about nutrition and physical therapy and the importance of keeping a horse's spirits up. On the 3rd day, she noticed something odd, a mark on the foal's neck hidden beneath his mane. She pushed the hair aside and saw it clearly, a freeze brand, a set of numbers and letters burned into the skin, faded but readable. Her heart began to pound. Freeze brands meant registration. Registration meant breeding records. She copied down the numbers carefully and went back to the library. This time she searched horse registries, entering the brand number into every database she could find. Most came back empty. Then she tried the American Quarter Horse Association, and the screen filled with information. The brand belonged to a colt named Silver Dollar's Last Chance. His sire was a champion cutting horse named Silver Dollar Doc, a stallion whose stud fee was listed at $15,000 per breeding. His dam was a mare named Chance's Lucky Lady, a national champion in reining. The colt had been reported stolen 8 months ago from a breeding facility in Oklahoma, along with 3 other young horses. The other 3 had been recovered. He hadn't. Margaret stared at the screen, her mind racing. This wasn't a worthless, crippled horse. This was a registered, purebred quarter horse with bloodlines that were worth a fortune. If he hadn't been injured, if he'd been whole and sound, he'd be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But he wasn't whole. He was broken, and according to the notes in the registry, he'd been injured during the theft. His leg shattered when the thieves' trailer crashed on a back road. They'd abandoned him, left him in a field to die. Somehow he'd survived. Somehow he'd ended up in the auction system, passed from one uncaring hand to another until he'd landed in that slaughter pen. Margaret printed the information, her hands shaking. She had no idea what to do with it. The breeding facility listed in the registry was 400 miles away. She had no phone to call them, no way to transport a horse even if they wanted him back. And why would they? He was damaged. He'd never race, never show, never compete. His value as a breeding animal was questionable at best with that leg. But he had value. That was the point. He had value that nobody had seen, worth that had been hidden beneath dirt and injury and bad luck, just like her, just like this farm, just like everything she'd lost. She walked home slowly, the printed pages folded in her pocket, her mind turning over possibilities. That evening, she sat in the barn with the foal, her back against the stall wall, and she talked to him. His registered name was too much of a mouthful, so she'd started calling him Chance, and he seemed to respond to it, his ears swiveling toward her when she said it. "Chance," she said quietly, "I found out who you are. I found out where you came from." His dark eyes watched her, patient and calm. She took a breath. "I don't know what to do. I could try to contact your owners, but what if they don't want you? What if they just have you put down because you're too expensive to fix?" The foal shifted his weight in the sling, making it creak. "Or," Margaret continued, "I could keep you. Try to heal you myself. But I don't have money. I don't have resources. I'm going to lose this place in 2 weeks. The foal lowered his head and touched her hand with his muzzle, a gentle bump that felt like encouragement. Margaret made her decision. She would contact the breeding facility, but not to give Chance back. She would offer them a deal. The next morning, she walked 3 miles to the feed store where there was a payphone. She fed in her quarters and dialed the number listed on the registry printout. A woman answered. "Rockin' M. Quarter Horses. This is Julie speaking. My name is Margaret Foster. I'm calling about a horse that was stolen from you last spring, a colt named Silver Dollar's Last Chance." There was a pause. Then the woman's voice changed, became sharp with attention. "You found him? Where is he? Is he alive?" "He's alive," Margaret said. "He's at my farm in Nebraska. But he's injured. His leg was broken and healed wrong. He can't walk normally." Another pause, longer this time. Then a man's voice came on the line. "This is Daniel Mitchell. I own Rockin' M." "You have our colt?" "Yes." Margaret gripped the phone receiver tightly. "But I need to be straight with you. I bought him at a livestock auction. I paid money for him. And he's in rough shape." Mitchell's voice was tense. "How rough?" Margaret described the leg, the condition he'd been in, what she'd done to help him. She heard Mitchell swear softly. Then his voice came back, careful now, calculating. "Ma'am, I appreciate you calling. That colt's got valuable bloodlines, but with an injury like that, he's not worth much to me. I can't breed him, can't show him. I'll give you $2,000 to cover your costs and take him off your hands." Margaret closed her eyes. $2,000. It was more money than she had. It would help, but it wouldn't save the farm. And something in Mitchell's voice, something careful and controlled, made her suspicious. "Mr. Mitchell," she said slowly, "if he's not worth much to you, why would you pay $2,000? There was a long silence. Then Mitchell laughed, a sound without humor. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for. All right. Truth is, that colt's got genetics we can't replace. His mother died. He's the last foal she'll ever produce. Even with that leg, if we can get him stable, if we can manage the pain, he could potentially stand at stud. Limited breeding, careful management, but his bloodline is too valuable to lose." "What's he really worth?" Margaret asked, "if he heals enough to breed?" Mitchell was quiet. Then he said, "Conservatively, if he can stand and breed naturally, we could charge $10,000 per breeding. Maybe get 10 to 15 mares a year on him. That's $150,000 in stud fees annually." Margaret's knees went weak. "I'll make you an offer," she said. Her voice was steady despite her racing heart. "I keep him. You pay for his medical care, his surgery, whatever he needs. I'll provide the facility, the daily care. When he's healed, if he can breed, we split the stud fees 50-50. Mitchell didn't answer right away. Margaret waited, her heart pounding. "Ma'am, that's asking me to invest tens of thousands in a horse you legally own, for maybe payoff down the line." Margaret took a breath. "Mr. Mitchell, I saved your horse's life. I pulled him out of a slaughter truck. I'm the reason he's alive to make you any money at all. And I'm offering you half of something that might be worth millions over his lifetime. You can say no, but then I hang up and you never see him again." She could hear Mitchell breathing on the other end of the line. Finally, he spoke. "You drive a hard bargain. Give me your address. I'll send our vet out tomorrow to assess him. If he thinks there's a chance, we'll draw up a contract." The veterinarian arrived the next afternoon in a truck with Oklahoma plates. A tall woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a braid and sharp, assessing eyes. Her name was Dr. Helen Crawford, and she spent an hour examining Chance, taking x-rays with a portable machine, checking his vitals, studying the healed break with a practiced eye. Margaret stood outside the stall, her stomach tight with anxiety, watching. Finally, Dr. Crawford turned to her. The bone healed at about a 30-degree angle. "It's not good, but I've seen worse. The joint above the break is still functional. With surgical intervention, pins and plates, extensive physical therapy, and probably a custom shoe, he could potentially bear enough weight to breed naturally. It'll cost about $60,000, all in. Surgery, rehab, medications, the works." Margaret felt dizzy. 60,000. It was an impossible amount, but it wasn't her money. It was Mitchell's gamble. "Will it hurt him? The surgery?" Dr. Crawford's expression softened. "Not if I do it right. And I'll make sure we manage his pain. This horse has been through enough. He deserves a fighting chance." Margaret looked at Chance. He was watching them both, his ears forward, his eyes calm. "Do it," she said. Dr. Crawford nodded. "I'll schedule surgery for next week. We'll do it at the veterinary hospital in Omaha. best orthopedic facilities in the state. You'll need to transport him." Margaret's heart sank. "I don't have a trailer or a truck." Dr. Crawford studied her for a moment, taking in the worn barn, the patched fences, the general air of poverty that hung over the place. "Mr. Mitchell said you drove a hard bargain. He didn't mention you were broke." "I'm not broke," Margaret said quietly. "I'm just between resources." Dr. Crawford smiled a quick flash of warmth. "I'll arrange transport. Consider it part of the deal." After the vet left, Margaret sat with Chance, her hand on his neck, and she told him what was coming. Surgery, pain, long recovery. But maybe, at the end of it, a chance to be whole again. The foal leaned into her touch, his eyes half closed, and she felt the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of him, the simple fact of his aliveness. 2 days later, a letter came in the mail. The bank, informing her that her foreclosure hearing had been postponed for 90 days due to a paperwork error. 90 days. 3 more months. It wasn't a miracle. It was a clerical mistake. But it felt like grace. The surgery took place on a cold morning in November, in a sterile white room that smelled of disinfectant and fear. Margaret wasn't allowed in the operating room, so she sat in the waiting area, her hands twisted together, her mind racing through every terrible possibility. What if he didn't wake up from anesthesia? What if the surgery failed? What if she'd pushed him through all this suffering for nothing? Dr. Crawford emerged 4 hours later, still in her scrubs, her face tired but satisfied. "He did great. The bones are pinned, the joint is stabilized. He'll need 6 months of careful rehab, but if he responds well, he should be able to put weight on that leg." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. "Thank you." Dr. Crawford sat down beside her. "Margaret, I've been a vet for 30 years. I've seen a lot of horses, worked on a lot of difficult cases, but I've never seen an animal fight the way this one did. He wanted to live. He wanted to get better. That's half the battle right there." She paused. "The other half is having someone who believes in him. He's lucky he found you." Margaret shook her head. "I think I'm the lucky one." Chance came home 3 days later, walking slowly down the trailer ramp on 4 legs for the first time since his injury. The leg was encased in a special boot, and he moved carefully, testing each step. But he moved. Margaret cried watching him, great heaving sobs of relief and joy, and Chance walked straight to her and tucked his head over her shoulder, a gesture that felt like a hug. The months that followed were hard in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. Chance required constant care, medicine 3 times a day, physical therapy exercises, careful monitoring for infection or complications. Dr. Crawford came weekly, then bi-weekly, adjusting his treatment, pushing him a little further each time. But Margaret also had a farm to save. The 90-day postponement was a gift, but it wasn't a solution. She needed income, so while Chance healed, she worked. She sold eggs from the chickens she'd managed to keep. She did sewing repairs for people in town. She cleaned houses. She took every odd job she could find, working dawn to midnight, saving every penny. And slowly, impossibly, she began to chip away at her debt. By March, Chance was walking without the boot. By April, he was trotting in the small pasture Margaret had repaired. By May, Dr. Crawford examined him one final time and declared him sound for limited breeding. Mitchell flew up personally to see him. The horse breeder stood at the pasture fence, watching Chance move, his experienced eye assessing every step, every movement. The colt had filled out, his coat gleaming silver in the spring sunlight, his mane floating like silk. He still limped. He always would. But he was whole. He was sound. He was magnificent. Mitchell turned to Margaret. I'll admit, I didn't think this would work. I thought I was throwing money at a lost cause. Margaret smiled. That's the thing about lost causes. Sometimes they're just causes nobody believed in yet. Mitchell nodded slowly. I've got 12 mares ready to breed. We'll start in June, see how he handles it physically. If he does well, we'll expand the program next year. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a check. This is for the first breeding season, your half in advance. Margaret took the check and looked at the amount, $60,000. She stared at it, the numbers blurring. This is too much. These breedings haven't happened yet. Mitchell shook his head. That's good faith money. You kept your end of the bargain. Time I kept mine. He paused. Also, I talked to my lawyer. The contract we drew up gives you full ownership of Chance. He's yours, Margaret. Whatever happens, whatever he earns, he's your horse. You saved him. You healed him. He belongs with you. Margaret couldn't speak. She just nodded, the check clutched in her hand. After Mitchell left, she walked to the pasture where Chance was grazing. She held up the check. Look at this. We did it. We actually did it. Chance raised his head, grass hanging from his mouth, and he walked over to her, his gait still uneven but strong. She wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed her face into his mane. Thank you, she whispered, for letting me save you, for saving me back. That afternoon, she went to the bank. She paid off her mortgage in full, her hand steady as she signed the papers. The bank manager looked at her with confusion and something like respect. Mrs. Foster, I have to say, I didn't expect this. Most people in your situation, Margaret smiled. Most people don't have a miracle standing in their barn. Word spread through Crossroads faster than fire. The widow, who'd traded her last cow for a crippled foal, had somehow turned him into a fortune. People who'd avoided her now stopped to talk. The rancher who'd seen her on the road that day came by to apologize for thinking she was crazy. The man who'd sold her Chance showed up drunk, demanding more money, claiming he'd been cheated. Margaret called the sheriff, showed him the bill of sale, and watched the man get escorted away. The breeding season that first year brought 10 foals, all healthy, all carrying Chance's exceptional bloodlines. They sold at auction for an average of $25,000 each. Margaret's share was $125,000. The second year brought 15 foals and even higher prices. By the third year, Chance was standing at stud for $8,000 per breeding, with a waiting list 2 years long. Margaret's farm, once dying, became a small but respected breeding operation. She hired help. She repaired buildings. She bought 3 good mares of her own. But more than the money, more than the success, what transformed Margaret was something simpler. She was needed again. The farm needed her. Chance needed her. The young people she hired as apprentices needed her knowledge and her guidance. She'd gone from being a woman alone and forgotten to being a woman with purpose and community. Chance lived to be 28 years old, a remarkable age for any horse, especially one who'd been so close to death. He sired over 200 foals in his lifetime, all carrying his gentle temperament and his exceptional conformation. His babies became champions in cutting, reining, and working cow horse. His bloodline spread across the country, a legacy of quality that traced back to a crippled yearling nobody wanted. When he finally passed, it was peacefully, in his sleep, in the pasture he loved, surrounded by his mares. Margaret buried him on the hill overlooking the farm, under a simple stone marker that read only his name and the dates of his life. She planted wildflowers on his grave, and every spring they bloomed, bright splashes of color against the brown earth. The farm continues today, run by one of Margaret's apprentices, a young woman named Rachel, who came looking for work and stayed to learn about horses and life. Margaret, now in her 70s, lives in the house David built, and she spends her mornings walking through the pastures, watching Chance's granddaughters and great-grandsons grazing in the sun. She tells the story sometimes when people ask about the widow and the crippled colt, about the day she traded everything for what looked like nothing. But she doesn't tell it as a story about money or success. She tells it as a story about vision, about seeing worth where others see waste, about choosing compassion over calculation, about trusting your heart even when your head says you're being a fool. The mathematics of that day still don't make sense. $850 for a cow. $850 for a horse that couldn't walk. A trade that should have been her final disaster. But the mathematics of love have never been logical. They operate according to laws that can't be measured in dollars or calculated on spreadsheets. They operate according to the ancient truth that value isn't always visible, that worth isn't always obvious, that sometimes the most important things are the ones everyone else has decided are worthless. Lancaster County remains a hard place, a landscape that demands everything and forgives nothing. The sky is still enormous, the weather still brutal, the land still unforgiving. Farms still fail, families still leave. The wind still blows dust across the empty fields where someone's dream used to grow. But on a small farm outside Crossroads, in a pasture that should have been foreclosed and forgotten, horses graze in the morning light. They carry in their blood the legacy of a colt who refused to die and a widow who refused to give up. And if you stand there quietly, if you watch the way they move, the way the light catches their coats, the way they lift their heads at the sound of footsteps approaching, you might understand something that has no words. That courage sometimes looks like foolishness. That wisdom sometimes sounds like madness. That the best investments we ever make are not the ones that promise the highest returns, but the ones that demand we risk everything for what we believe is right. Margaret learned this truth in a dusty auction yard on the worst day of her life. She learned it again in a barn at midnight, caring for a dying horse with money she didn't have. She learned it every day for years, through surgery and setbacks, through doubt and determination, through the long, slow work of healing. And what she learned, what that broken foal taught her, was this: that we are never as poor as we think we are, that we are never as powerless as we feel, that even in our darkest moments, even when we've lost everything, we still have the power to choose compassion over cruelty, hope over despair, love over fear. The auction yard still operates in Crossroads every second Saturday, a place where fortunes change hands and lives pivot on single decisions. The same auctioneer calls the same chant, numbers rising and falling in their ancient rhythm. The same slaughter truck parks at the same spot, waiting for the animals nobody wants. But something is different now. Sometimes when a horse is too old or too sick or too injured, when the auctioneer's voice goes flat with resignation and the bidding stalls at meat prices, a certain widow in her 70s raises her card. She doesn't do it every time. She can't save them all, but she saves some. She brings them home to her farm. These horses everyone has decided are finished, and she gives them what chance gave her. A second chance. Some heal, some don't. Some live for years in peaceful retirement. Some only make it a few months. but all of them spend their final days knowing kindness. All of them learn that not every human is cruel. All of them discover, in whatever time they have left, what it feels like to be valued. And Margaret, watching them graze in the evening light, thinks about value and worth and the strange mathematics of the heart. She thinks about David and Rosie, and the day she traded everything for what everyone called nothing. She thinks about a crippled foal with terrified eyes and the moment their lives intersected and changed each other forever. She thinks about all the invisible worth in the world, all the value that goes unseen, all the treasure people walk past because they're looking at the wrong things. The sun sets over Lancaster County, painting the enormous sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the horses in the pasture move like ghosts through the long grass. Margaret watches them, her heart full of a peace she never expected to find, and she understands what she couldn't have known that day in the auction yard. That when you save something, when you choose mercy over sense and compassion over calculation, you're not just changing their life. You're changing your own. You're choosing the kind of person you want to be. You're declaring that some things matter more than money, that some choices define you more than success, that some moments ask you to be brave enough to look foolish. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the things we save often save us back, that compassion is never wasted even when it seems foolish, that sometimes the worst decisions turn out to be the best ones, then subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that miracles hide in broken places, that worth isn't always visible, that choosing kindness over calculation is never the wrong choice. Because these stories matter. They remind us that wealth isn't measured only in dollars, that success isn't measured only in profit, that the richest lives are the ones where we dared to value what others dismissed. They show us that in the spaces between logic and love, between calculation and compassion, between what makes sense and what feels right, there exists a kind of magic that transforms everything it touches. Margaret Foster traded a cow for a crippled horse and became a millionaire. But the real fortune wasn't the money. It was discovering that she was the kind of person who would make that trade. It was learning that she had the courage to choose mercy when everyone called it madness. It was understanding that the most valuable things in life are the ones you can't put a price on. The lesson is simple and profound. When something broken asks for your help, when something worthless by the world's measure looks at you with hope, when you have the chance to choose compassion even though it costs you everything, choose compassion. Because you never know what miracle is hiding beneath the surface. You never know what treasure is wrapped in poverty's clothing. You never know when the thing you save might turn out to be the thing that saves you.